Hello, everyone. Welcome to the TF Blockchain Podcast, where we interview blockchain and digital currency innovators building our distributed future. I'm your host and founder of TF Blockchain, Jonathan G. Blanco. TF Blockchain hosts premier conferences, events, and media featuring blockchain leaders actively growing the industry. With our platform, we are connecting business and technology executives with blockchain innovators leading the charge. Through our interactive speaker presentations, facilitated networking sessions, and our video and podcast series. Before we get started, wanted to tell you about our consulting arm, TF Agency, where we work with blockchain companies, companies looking to adopt the technology, entrepreneurs and investors looking to understand the space, and with those looking to grow their career in this emerging industry. For more information, please email us at info@tfagency.io. This episode is a live recording from our TF Blockchain Austin chapter held on June 20th, 2019, where I interview Mance Harmon, CEO and co-founder of Hedera Hashgraph, a decentralized public network using distributed ledger technology so that startups and enterprises are able to develop fast, fair, and secure applications. In this episode, Mance and I discuss how Hedera Hashgraph was started, his history with his co-founder Libre, how enterprises will adopt blockchain, his thoughts on the recent Facebook Libre announcement, how there are some similarities to what Hedera has already done, and the announcements made earlier that day about Hedera's consensus services. I really enjoyed my conversation with Mance, and we had a great interactive discussion at our most recent TF Blockchain Austin. I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as our Austin community. Make sure to follow all future live recordings at tfblock.io. All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for being here today in Austin. And we're really excited to welcome Mance, the CEO and co-founder of Hedera Hashgraph. Thank you for coming down here from Dallas. Please introduce yourself to everybody.
Thank you. Well, I'm Mance Harmon. I'm the co-founder, as already mentioned, of Hedera Hashgraph. My co-founder is Lehman Baird. He's not with me here tonight, but Lehman and I have been doing this since 2015 now, and actually he started working on this back in 2012 on the algorithm Hashgraph, and had a breakthrough in 2015, and that's when we started the company.
Awesome. So just for clarity, so when he was working on it, it was the Hashgraph as like a protocol, right? And then turning that into a company is the Hedera part?
Well, so it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Okay.
Yeah. So he started in 2012 trying to just solve a general problem of how to have strong or secure distributed consensus that's highly performant at the same time. And he wanted to maximize both dimensions. And he worked on that for 3 years. And then in 2015, he sort of cracked the nut, so to speak. He solved the problem. We started a company. It's called Swirlds. And Swirlds focused on private or permission networks for a couple of years, just building out that initial code base and developing the theory alongside of it. And then in 2017, we came to the point where we could begin to sort of explore the creation of what today we're now calling Hedera Hashgraph. And Hedera is separate from Swirlds and is focused on taking to market this global public network that's built on the Hashgraph algorithm.
Yeah. Excellent. So explain for those that might not be familiar what Hedera Hashgraph is, or what makes it different from how you're thinking about blockchain, distributed ledger, so forth.
Yeah. So from a protocol perspective, Hashgraph, like I said, it sort of maximizes security and performance at the same time. There's always been this trade-off between the two. You can have better performance in a private network or better security in a public network at the expense of several things. And Hashgraph achieves something called asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance, which simply is the theoretical limit of what can be achieved for the category of distributed consensus. In terms of security, ABFT is the best you can achieve. At the same time, it optimizes bandwidth usage, and that in turn turns into fantastic performance in terms of transactions per second.
Right.
Yep.
And so it seems like who Hedera might be targeting as a customer base would be different than some of the other chains.
Well, so Hedera is focused on building an enterprise-grade public distributed ledger. Correct. And when I say that, I mean, people will think about enterprise use cases. We certainly think about enterprise use cases. But the reality is that if it's good enough for mission-critical applications, all the better for those that aren't.
Yeah.
And so we're focused both on the DApp or startup community, while at the same time really giving emphasis to the enterprise community as well. And that plays out in the whole structure of the organization and our governance model, and just a whole range of decisions are dependent upon our vision for what a public distributed ledger will look like that eventually goes mainstream.
Yeah. And, one of the things that people often talk about, or I feel like I hear a lot when you think about enterprise, is this lack of desire to be public, right? Like they might want a private chain, or, they don't want their data available, regardless if it's cryptographically secured. So, how are you getting past that on the public side?
Yeah, so it's a great question. This was not a setup, by the way, but this is something that we just announced today.
Yeah, and when he says it's not a setup, just so you know, I even told Mance this ahead of time. I purposely did not send Mance any questions, and that's how we handle a lot of our conversations, is because we want to make sure this is as real of a conversation as possible. So yeah, Mance and I did not have any talk about what we were going to discuss. So yeah, I'm excited to hear it.
Well, so if you look at private networks, one of the attractive features is that they're private, and that the data is not out there for public consumption. The other attractive feature, or another attractive feature, is that you can have dedicated resources for an application, a single application. And so you can scale it in ways that would be difficult to scale in a public network. Now, the public network, by contrast, is often more trustworthy because you have far more nodes. And the nodes are typically run by different entities. It's not all the same people running the nodes. And in a private network, it could be 4 nodes versus 1,000 in a public network, et cetera. So you have a better trust model in the public network. But the downside of the public network is that if you're running smart contracts, for example, and you're an application using that public network, you're sharing the resources of the nodes in the network. Every node in the network is running every smart contract for every app. Well, that's and it's expensive. So how do you sort of get the best of both is the question, right? You want the trust of a public network, but at the same time, you like the idea of having dedicated servers for running the business logic and storing the information and providing privacy.
For sure.
For sure. I mean, that's the ideal, right?
Yeah.
And so what we announced today with a live stream and a white paper is a new service. The market's not seen it before. We call it the Hedera Consensus Service. And basically, we've exposed the Hashgraph algorithm transaction ordering directly to the developer community. And what this makes it possible to do is exactly what I just described. You can take a centralized application running on a server, and that server is fully dedicated to that application, and have it calling our consensus service, passing the transactions. Or maybe you have clients like, let's say just take an example. Let's say it's a stock exchange or a matching platform for a stock exchange.
Okay.
And you have client software on phones making trades. Well, those phones call our consensus ordering service. The ordering service puts all of those transactions into consensus order and then streams it to a mirror node, a read-only node of our network, where the matching platform sits. And then the matching platform uses that, it does the matching, and presents the results to the clients. So we've taken the trust of a public network, and we've made it possible for private applications running on dedicated servers where they can protect privacy and co-opt that trust from the public network. And we announced this today with IBM. And the reason IBM was there as part of this is that when you think about what I just described, you can now envision how you take Fabric, from Hyperledger, Hyperledger Fabric, and run Fabric applications that use the Hedera consensus service for their transaction ordering. And you get the best of both worlds.
Got it. So it sounds like it's just all about making calls, right? Kind of like an API call.
It's an API call.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It is a straight API call.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So when you call our network, Hedera,
yeah,
there's a set of APIs. And in this case, you just make an API call. You pass it a transaction, a message, and the network is receiving messages from lots of clients. Yeah. Takes all of those, puts them into a consensus order with a timestamp, a consensus timestamp, and streams those messages out in a trusted stream to the applications, and they consume them, and there you have it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, who would be a good use case, or what kind of industry would be a good use case for this?
Yeah. Well, look, the funny thing is, the entire quote blockchain market can take advantage of this.
Right.
What we're doing is simply making a fundamental improvement. I mean, you no longer have to have smart contracts.
Yeah.
Where you're using Solidity or Move, just we heard about from Facebook this week, or whatever. You don't have to be constrained in that way. You have your favorite development environment today you're building on, just use it.
Yeah.
Run it on your computer.
Yeah.
And then make API calls. It's that simple. And now I'm oversimplifying a little bit. There's some more complexity to it. But everybody that is in the space of distributed consensus can take advantage of this model that's previously not been available.
Yeah, and so on the API calls, so it sounds like nothing would need to live on any sort of Hedera server.
Exactly. That's the funny thing about it, right? So,
because I feel like I've heard of people attempting to do similar things, but then it's more of like a copy, and then it sits on a server. And
right.
So there's no Hedera server storing this data
or
anything like that.
No. Well, so look, you have the messages that the application is generating, or again, we'll use the stock market example. I have my wallet on my phone, and I want to do a trade, and I create a transaction, and I submit it to the Hedera consensus service. I probably am just submitting a hash of that trade. And maybe I'm encrypting that trade as well, potentially. There are multiple ways you could do this. And then that information gets put into a consensus order and passed to the mirror node, the read-only node that's running alongside the platform, the matching platform. And so, no, there's nothing stored in plain text, and you can actually add some crypto tricks so that even if it's encrypted, it can be treated in such a way where it becomes impossible. It's basically ephemeral. The encryption piece of this becomes ephemeral, so that at no point is there any private information that's practically being passed through or at rest on the Hedera network. It's all the private information stays private on the private server.
So what do you think your competitors say to this, right? So what would Ethereum, what would the Ethereum network or anybody that's about smart contracts say as a converse as to why this would not be a good idea? Or can they?
Well, probably not. I don't think that they would say it's a bad idea. I don't think anybody will say this is a bad idea. What I would say is that there are cases when you're going to want to have multiple instances. So again, back with the stock market or the matching platform example, maybe there'll be cases where you're going to want multiple instances of that matching platform running so that you can check the results from each instance.
Yeah.
Right. And so in some cases, you're going to stand up more nodes in this sort of application network is what we're calling it. And that costs some money, and there's some complexity. Fabric makes that easier. That's part of the reason for the relationship with Hyperledger. If you don't want to go to that trouble and you're not going to be using a lot of smart contracts, and so your cost is going to be pretty low, You're not building a really complicated application or
'Cause-
DApp.
So it sounds
Then
like
maybe use smart contracts.
yeah, because things won't necessarily be getting written down every time, right?
Yeah, so it's just the level of it's going to boil down to, is there enough performance in a public network using smart contracts? Do I care about privacy? And what's the cost going to be? And based on those set of answers, you may or may not want to go with our consensus service. In my opinion, you can never have too much CPU, and you can never have too much storage. And if you're writing anything real, then having it run on a single server or a central server or an app network that's running these servers is going to be cheaper than executing the same thing on a public network that's running these smart contracts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how would this be different than just doing a plain old side chain?
So the trust is different. In side chains, what you have is a group of people that are processing transactions among themselves, and they have to trust each other. And so maybe you even use some consensus algorithm to up-level the trust in that side chain. And then occasionally the results of that of those transactions get written, maybe a snapshot of the state gets written to a public chain for posterity. So in that model, you still have to have a side chain, and you have to trust the members, maybe use consensus. And when you trust them, that means that 2/3 of them have to be trustworthy.
Yeah.
In our case, there's no side chain. It's that we are doing the transaction ordering on the main network. And as long as a single node is trustworthy in this AppNet that I'm describing, then you're safe, right? Anybody can run, assuming anybody can run the application, or maybe there's an auditor that's running the application, but it only takes one honest person running the application and consuming that stream of transactions to check whether or not anybody else is lying about the transactions, the validation of the transactions. And so it's a much better trust model. On the Hedera side, you have to have 2/3 of the nodes be honest to have the trust. On the app network side, as long as a single member is honest, you're good. On a side chain, you have to have two networks that are both in both cases require 2/3 of the members to be honest.
Yeah. And even still, there could be an issue with completing that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, let's do a flashback real quick. Let's kind of, if this was a movie, we're doing that flashback. How did Mance get started? How did you get started in just technology to begin with?
Oh, wow. So I've been programming since I was in middle school, 6th grade. In fact, I don't think I've ever told this story publicly, but I
heard it here.
Yeah,
you heard it here first.
We had my mom. I wanted a computer,
Yeah.
and we didn't have a lot of money, and so my mom had a garage sale. We had a garage sale, and we raised $100, and we went down to Walmart, and I bought my first computer, which was a TI 99-4A, a Texas Instruments computer. And that's where I learned to code. I used to write in BASIC, and I remember my first modem, 2400 baud. The old coupler. We don't have phones like this anymore, nor modems, right? But so most of you probably don't know what I'm talking about. But way back, early modems. You take your phone handset and push it down into this coupling device. And I've loved it ever since. And so I've grown up, comp sci, a couple degrees in comp sci, always wanted to be on the cutting edge. Started in machine learning, reinforcement learning, before anybody knew what reinforcement learning was back in the 90s.
Wow.
Lehman and I were doing research together in reinforcement learning back in the 90s. And by the way, we've been working together since 93, since 1993.
That's like the exact thing investors want to hear. Is like, how long have you known your co-founder? Forever.
Yeah. So 25 years. It's longer than most marriages, right?
Yeah.
It's so, but it's always been hardcore tech. And the funny thing is, I knew from early in the 90s that I would never be Lehman's equal when it came to the technology. And so I decided to give up and focus on business. And of course, I've still been in the tech, but I've focused on learning how to take tech and commercialize it and
Make
be able
it
to
digestible
communicate
to
it.
everybody.
Exactly. And the relationship is a great one. He solves really hard problems and builds fantastic software and products, and I try to take care of the other half of that business.
Awesome. And then so with that, so you two have been together for a while in this tech space. What's your blockchain or crypto origin story? How did that come about?
Yeah, well, so it started off with just sort of a vision of Lehman's. Lehman wanted to make it possible for us, people, consumers, to sort of reach out and take a slice of cyberspace and invite friends to participate, maybe business colleagues to participate in this virtual world, and work together and play together and exchange goods and services with one another without having to trust a third party with our privacy and our data or our money.
Yeah.
Right.
How long have you guys? How long have you been talking about this?
Well, that started in 2012.
Yeah.
And back then he called it a distributed object store. This was, a technical term to describe what he had envisioned in his mind. Blockchain had nothing to do with this. Certainly Bitcoin was around, but it didn't really inform his thinking when deciding to pursue this. And then he worked on it for years. I was in the world of identity, working for a company as the head of labs and architecture, and I started looking at Bitcoin and blockchain in 2014, just as are there identity applications, and realized no, not really, not with the performance and the constraints of Bitcoin, but understood that what he was solving, was enable identity applications, but way beyond that, right? You can actually realize the vision with Hashgraph, and that was it. He solved the problem, and I remember lots of evenings here in Austin, meeting with him at a Starbucks, just talking about the latest iteration, going down the rabbit hole. I mean, there were probably 1,000 of them until we got to the point where he figured it out.
Yeah, awesome. So you're up in Dallas, and so did you used to live here in Austin, or?
Yeah, we actually lived in Cedar Park.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what brought the company to Dallas, or why Dallas?
It's funny. Austin was the longest I've ever lived in one place. Prior to that point, I'd never lived in one place for more than 3 or 4 years. So we ended up moving to College Station for family reasons, and decided, okay, it's time to, and that's where the company actually started. I think we actually founded the company in the fall of 15, and we were already in College Station at that point. We decided to move and considered, well, we've been to Austin for 10 years, haven't been to Dallas, but we wanted to stay in Texas.
Yeah.
And yes, and there are family reasons as well for being up there. But we decided to make that move, and it's as simple as that.
Cool.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some interesting companies here in Texas. Big companies like Dell started here, and then a lot of Google and Facebook are here. What are your thoughts about just the state of Texas when it comes to blockchain and this really interesting technology?
Well, look, we're doing everything we can to help make it a center of excellence, right? And I know that there's a lot of activity in New York, on the coasts, and in some major cities internationally. But we also are excited by a lot of work that's going on here in Austin. For sure, we've got partners here in Austin that we're now working with, and I love Texas. All right, I didn't grow up here, but I got here as soon as I could, and so we want to do what we can as a company, to And we understand our position, certainly in the Dallas market, as a company that's achieved this level of scale and funding, and so we are doing everything we can to foster that ecosystem.
Awesome. Let's kind of move over to current events or the current state of things. We're kind of in this state right now where Bitcoin has gone up considerably, and I don't want to get into the Bitcoin pricing side of things, but more of what have you seen that do for the appetite towards blockchain, or towards either from an investment side or working with partners, or even like the excitement in the room at Hedera?
Yeah. Well, when we started, we raised a lot of money, and as soon as that money came in, we converted it. It was maybe 50-50 fiat and Bitcoin. And soon as...
What was the date? When was that again?
This was in starting roughly Q1 of 18 last year through the middle of the summer. And so over that period, we raised $124 million. And as soon as it came in, we converted the Bitcoin to fiat because we knew there was a crypto winter coming. We always believed there would be a crypto winter.
Yeah.
And so we converted to fiat as soon as it came in. And then winter hit, and we said hooray, right? Because we thought that would be a really good thing for the market, and it would reduce a lot of the fraud. It would weed out the junk projects, which it has done, and we knew there would be a spring. And so we didn't know how long winter would last. And we've seen a change in attitudes now. For the past couple of months, we've felt spring coming on.
Yeah.
I think it's, spring is now fully upon us, and we're heading into summer. And I think Facebook, by the way, helped solidify that.
Yeah.
This with their announcement this week. And so we prepared ourselves, understanding there could be a long winter. So we weren't scared of it. We were welcoming it and looking forward to making it through to the other side.
Yeah, I find it interesting too. I think about, talking with people, investors and so forth. Actually, when things were on the upcycle 2017, and there's just a lot of speculation, but then there's also a lot of just reservation, right? Like, I don't know, like this doesn't seem good. And then it goes up. It's like, well, maybe I'm too late. And then it crashes. And then you get this kind of negativity. But what I find really interesting now is some of the traditional investors that I've been speaking to, and people have stayed in the sidelines, their ears are perking up a little bit. They're like, oh, like, tell me again about that blockchain thing you've been doing, or tell me again about that.
Yeah.
So
I think that the industry will go mainstream. Yeah. You see, even through crypto winter, infrastructure kept being built.
Right.
Lots of investment kept happening.
And I think that's exactly what needed to happen, right? There's obviously financial reasons as to why someone might care about the currency going up or down, but we're in this because we're bought into the technology piece, right? And
exactly.
So it just, yeah.
No, I think, I'm very optimistic about the industry. I think that we've made it through the worst, and the real projects are still around. Some are going to die off.
Yeah.
But there's a new beginning of a new level of maturity in the projects that acknowledges mainstream requirements for using these platforms. I'm talking about the protocols now.
Yeah.
For using these platforms, and now there's an increased focus on building solutions that take advantage of the platforms, and the solutions that the business buyer, the manager that's writing a check to purchase these solutions maybe doesn't even know that it's, quote, blockchain under the hood. Totally. It doesn't matter.
Right. Like,
right?
Yeah. Back in, pre-2017, you would hear a lot of companies or a lot of people say like, oh, I have this really interesting blockchain company, and we're thinking about doing, advertising technology. Or I have this really interesting blockchain company, and we have real estate. And now it's the opposite. It's like, oh, I have this real estate tech company, and we're leveraging blockchain technology,
exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And really the way it should be is it's just a piece of the technology because you still need to have that whole front end experience that is solving the customer pain point. That what's under the hood, the user doesn't care about.
Well, that's interesting, right? So maybe there was no other way around this, but you have to build the bottom of the stack first.
Yeah.
Right? You have to build that infrastructure layer before you can think about building the SaaS layer. And you get the platform layer in between. You've got infrastructure that is the plumbing of the stack, and then you've got a platform layer that makes it easier for developers to build their applications, realize their vision. That platform layer, the PaaS layer, the middle layer is now becoming a focus for the first time. And then on top of that, you have solutions. And some companies have just gone straight to vertically integrating. They build the SaaS layer and the needed middle layer components and take advantage of the bottom layer, that network layer. But you had to start at the bottom.
Right.
And we've now got the bottom layer and new versions of that coming out this year, and a focus on the middle layer and the solutions. So the industry is just beginning to mature.
I totally agree. It's evolving, and frankly, you're going to have things that might resemble blockchain or like take in blockchain elements, but might not really be blockchain, right? And so that's, you brought up Facebook a second ago. Some people are making that argument that, hey, Facebook is not a blockchain or it's not a true cryptocurrency. We don't necessarily have to get into that, but
Sure.
or maybe we do. But it's interesting because whether it is or it isn't, let's just go with the narrative that it isn't for a second, right? But if the mainstream assumes it is, that only helps blockchain projects, right? Like that only helps like the narrative of what's going on. If it is, all the better.
Well, look, I think that what happened this week may be one of the most important events ever in our category.
I totally agree.
Category. Look, the addressable market just went up by a lot.
Yeah.
And we can thank Facebook for that.
Yeah.
But what else happened is that they have, this is self-serving, but they validated our model, right? We have been building a governing council of global enterprises to be sort of the council that manages or helps us manage the platform. And you got to have something like that to bootstrap trust in a cryptocurrency or in a platform like this at all. And now Facebook has done the same thing, right? They've announced their the Libre Alliance, which is the same thing as our Hedera Governing Council, and so that's gratifying, right? That's for us. That's gratifying to see that validation from a global business like Facebook, and I think that the result of that is that the bar has just been raised. It's no longer enough to simply have a protocol in a community.
Yeah,
that's no longer going to be sufficient. You now have to have a protocol, a community, and you have to have a group of nodes of validators that are well respected by the market to be honest and trustworthy. And that's also part of this market maturing, right? If you want it to go mainstream, what's that even mean? Going mainstream means that businesses have to trust the governance of the network.
Right.
And that's what we're talking about here, is that our model for governance has now been validated by a company like Facebook. And we're excited by that.
Yeah, I think what happens in this Facebook scenario too is, it was just last year? Was it last year or the year before where the Cambridge Analytica stuff happened and the privacy happened? So there's definitely a big lack of trust going on.
Yeah.
So I totally get that. I think the other thing also has to do with is, when you think about how it's structured, it seems like it's going to be a little bit more centralized, right? This information.
So for Facebook, yeah, there's some serious differences between
that and a tradition. And when people say like, oh, it's you just can't compare it to Bitcoin, right?
No,
like
not at all.
When people say like, oh, it's going to displace Bitcoin or Bitcoin will still win out. My position at least is that I don't think Facebook cares about the crypto community personally. They just care about their network, right? Like, so like they don't need people who have Bitcoin wallets to adopt Libre. They need people who have Facebook accounts to adopt Libre, right?
Exactly. They don't.
So
So it's good and bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's exactly my point, is that like, that doesn't mean it's good. I'm not saying I think it's good per se. I was talking about this with someone earlier. It was like, I think it's good. It's very good for Facebook, right? In the sense of like in-network currency, and they get lots of data. And is that really good for all the people? I don't think it is.
Only
like,
only if Facebook wins. Right. It's not good for all the. Okay. It's just. I guess I can say this on the air.
You can, whatever you want.
But no, I would not think that it would be a good thing if Facebook wins. But there's no particular reason to believe that Facebook is going to win.
Yeah, I agree.
And I mean, they're big, right? They're big, and they have a massive community, but they have a large reputation as well. And their size, while it's their strength, it's also their weakness.
Yeah.
And they're going to be targeted. And they've got some serious problems with the way that they have structured some parts of this. They're going to have regulatory problems that we don't have, for example.
Yeah.
And but on the whole, this is part of mainstreaming the category. And I do believe that the result of this is that more money will flow in, and companies that would never have seriously considered diving into this now will.
I 1,000% agree with that. So it's really funny. My dad drove me to the airport when I came down here, and he's like, "Oh, so yeah, I just found out Facebook did that Bitcoin thing that you're doing," and I'm like, "Well,
exactly."
I'm like,
no, same thing. My wife on the road down here was explaining to my mother-in-law, they're now competing with Facebook.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and it was funny.
Oh no!
It was funny because when my dad said like that Bitcoin thing, I was like, well, first, Dad, my company isn't in Bitcoin. We do use blockchain, and like it was just a really funny way to say it. It makes me think of a different conversation I had earlier in the week when I was talking with someone about a partnership, and never once did I use the words Bitcoin. Like the word Bitcoin never came out of my mouth, and I was just talking about like how an in-network token works and like the benefits of having an in-network token. And like I personally believe like in the future, that's really what's going to win out, is that you'll have like different retailers or different network and platforms that they just have their independent token, right? So anyways, we were talking about this. And anyways, later it turned out that they didn't want to do the deal with me. And what the response was like, yeah, we like the conversation, but we're just not really all about this Bitcoin thing that you're talking about. And I was like, again, I never said the words Bitcoin.
I understand.
So I love to kind of move a conversation there. Is how do we kind of unify that message or make it more digestible for the broader market to understand that like there's a lot of differences in the protocols and the currencies and the use cases behind it, because you're not going to use your Bitcoin the same way that you're going to use your Libre or any other altcoin, right?
Yeah, at the end of the day, when we're talking about a mass market, mass consumer market, all that matters is the application and the user experience.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's built on blockchain or distributed ledger technology is kind of incidental. It's almost like, quote, Intel Inside. They don't care, right? What they care about is, can they run their word processor on their computer?
Yeah.
And I think that will be true here as well. And so while there are each of the major protocol platforms, they do have to make design decisions. How you use RAM versus hard drive space for what services, et cetera. All of those have an implication on what use cases you can address. And so there will be differences across the platforms just because there are choices that have to be made for limited resources. But the mass market will realize they'll have the opportunity to use applications that provide them new features that they didn't have before, or security in a way they didn't have it before. And it will just become part of the quote internet, or the Web 3.0 or whatever.
For sure, right? Yeah. It's not like, oh, you have this interesting blockchain, tool. It's that your information is more secure, or you can exchange value, or get compensated or rewarded for some action that you took.
Yeah,
right?
they will see new companies come to market with product offerings that are cool with new features that they'd not seen before, and that's when they will, and if it's said, this is because of blockchain, then maybe the consumer will know it. But when it's mass adopted, they won't even know it.
Yeah, they don't even care.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think it seems like a good point to open it up for questions from the audience. One thing I wanted to ask a favor of everybody real quick is we didn't take pictures yet, and I was wondering if you all wouldn't mind taking a couple pictures while we keep going and of everybody, and tweeting those to at TF Blockchain. That's our handle, and definitely follow us on Twitter at TF Blockchain. But yeah, with that, I'd love to open up to questions. Anybody that has one, go ahead and shoot. And what we'll do, since we're recording, is we'll just repeat the question into the mic so we can make sure we get it.
I was in the impression Hashgraph was private, and with Hedera, is it a merger? Have you found that?
No. So Swirlds.
So real quick, so the question is Hedera private, or that was the impression?
Yeah. So there's yes, correct. The impression was Hashgraph is private. Swirlds was the company that first used Hashgraph, the algorithm. And yes, Swirlds used it for private networks only. And then in 2017, Lehman and I spun out Hedera as a subsidiary, and it remained a wholly owned subsidiary until February of this year, when we added our first tranche of council members. So Hedera is a corporation, an LLC, and it has this council of global blue chip organizations, and they are members of the LLC. So it's not just a marketing agreement. We actually went through M&A with nearly all of these. In some cases, they had to get board level approval to become members. And when that happened, it became separate from Swirlds. Swirlds is a member, like the other members, but it's on par with all the other members. And Hedera is focused on building a public network that uses the Hashgraph algorithm. In fact, we'll be launching that. It's in community tests now. The Mainnet's been around since August of last year, and we'll be launching that network later this summer. Yeah, and it's public, of course.
Who else has a question?
You mentioned the Hashgraph consensus algorithm. You released a white paper. Is the whole thing open source, like the actual implementation?
It is not.
So is the question is the Hedera Hashgraph consensus, is that open source?
No. So the answer is no, and let me explain why. So we are going to release the source code. So when we get to version 1 for Hedera, we're going to put everything on GitHub or something so that you can see every line of code. And I mean that, every line of code. It's not like some projects where certain parts of the code are held back and you can't actually review it. But it's not open source. It's what we'll call open review. The reason for this is that we view as one of the big obstacles to mainstream adoption of these public networks is the fact that they can fork or split into competing networks. And in fact, a lot of people attribute a split in one of the Bitcoin forks last fall to sort of kicking off crypto winter. And but the technical problem is that if you're building an application on a public network, and that public network then holds the state of your application, and then that public network hard forks or splits into a competing set of networks. Well, the client software in the field that has been connecting to the original network, it still connects to the same nodes, and it's still making transactions. But the nodes now have split. And so some of those, some of the nodes go with the old network, some go with the new. So when transactions happen, they're happening on two separate networks, and the state of the application diverges. You have chaos as an application developer. And so you have to fundamentally solve that problem. And the way that we're solving that is through a combination of legal controls as well as technical controls. And I can go into the technical piece as well. But because of the approach that we've taken, and it's a defensive posture when it comes to the IP, to the patents, we're able to make a commitment to the market that the platform will never fork. So Hashgraph or Hedera, the Hedera network, will never fork, and that brings stability to enterprise customers and mainstream markets that doesn't currently exist in pure open source projects. But we recognize that there's a need to let the world see every line of code. That's part of the trust, is you can download it, you can run it, you can see it, the results of it, etc. And there's no license required to use it. I mean, it's just like Ethereum in that sense. You have API calls, and for each API call, you pay for it using our cryptocurrency, HBAR. So it's just like one of the normal other open source projects, except we're protecting the network by keeping it from forking, bringing stability where there doesn't otherwise exist.
Will your mainnet be released prior to your coin being released?
Will your mainnet be released prior to your coin being?
So the mainnet is operational today.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a community test program going on. I think we have something like 10,000 users at this point, and so there. I don't know. We have 500 dApps that have registered for test nets, and they're building product. And so there's been test nets. There's been mainnet with community test program, and later this summer we will come to a moment in time where community test is over. We consider the mainnet hardened, and we're ready to open it up so that anybody that wants to can create an account anonymously and use the network. And at that point, we will release tokens into the market. Yep.
Over there?
What are some of the initial use cases that you see happening with the consensus service that you just released?
Yeah. So
What are some of the what are some initial use cases with the consensus algorithm you have?
So there are a few in the white paper. I mean, an obvious one is a matching platform and that's the reason I kept using it earlier. Is what's interesting to me personally is that if you have a centralized exchange, a matching platform that's running an exchange today that is centralized, and you want to turn it into a DEX, a distributed exchange, then you very easily could just do that by using this consensus service. And it's almost trivial to do that. So that's a great example. And then you choose your favorite Hyperledger application that's in the market today. IBM has a couple of big ones that they've looked, that's gotten a lot of press. And what we make it possible to do for the Hyperledger community, and it's not unique to Hyperledger, it just we're partnered with IBM to explore this with Hyperledger, but anybody could do it. Could do it with Quorum, or R3 could do it with Corda, EEA, etc. But if you have a Hyperledger project running on Fabric, and you don't want to have to get a collection of partners to stand up nodes or infrastructure and build your own private network, you no longer have to. You put your Hyperledger instance on a computer, you call Hedera for message ordering, the transaction ordering service, that's what it's called inside of Fabric, uses Hedera's consensus service, and you get the trust of a public network. So I wouldn't say that there's a favorite, because it's so foundational, it's so low in the stack. It is the consensus ordering service, which is with the trust of the public network. It's foundational to every distributed consensus use case.
Anybody else have a question?
So I have a background in DevOps engineering, and one of my favorite stacks is the Hashi stack from HashiCorp. That actually had sparked my initial interest into
Hashgraph because a lot of the underlying infrastructure is the same. The gossip protocol, that's actually the only one I can think of at the top of my head, but I can almost map out how that might look if you rolled console, Vault, and Nomad as far as infrastructure goes. I guess the question is there any parity with HashiCorp? Also,
I've never heard of them, honestly.
HashiConf 2019 is coming up in September, and if you wanted to scalp good engineers or good employers, if you wanted
Yeah.
to forward to London, I would totally recommend it.
No, thank you. Well, look, I don't have a DevOps background, but my DevOps guys probably would know about it, and I'm sure that the engineering team maybe knows about it as well. So I can't really comment on that one in particular. But the way I think about the consensus service, if you're a developer and you know Kafka, right?
Sure.
This is Kafka.
Yeah.
Right? But it's a global, public, trusted Kafka service. In fact, the messages, when you submit a message to our consensus service, you give it a topic name. So you have messages with topics, and they're coming in from everywhere, from everybody. And the consensus service puts messages in consensus order by topic, and you just consume it. So it's that layer of the stack that we're talking about. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm a big fan of Hashgraph. And also, I would like to say that staying closed source to prevent a fork in terms of the Bitcoin example is probably the most respectable answer I've heard for staying closed source.
Oh.
Good response. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We've given it a lot of thought. It's been very controversial, as you can imagine. I mean, we're in a market where if you're not open source, then you are you're the evil empire or something, right?
Yeah.
But what we did was try to start from first principles in understanding why is it that there hasn't been mainstream adoption, and we identified a whole set. And then when designing and making business decisions about not just the tech, but the business of Hedera and how you mainstream it, then we said, how do we solve this set of problems? And stability, that's what I'm calling it categorically, having a stable network that you don't have to worry about splitting was one of the requirements that we had to address. Yep.
Thank you for listening to the TF Blockchain Podcast. We appreciate your support as we continue our mission to connect the broader business and technology community with blockchain innovators. For the most up-to-date information on all things TF Blockchain, please visit tfblock.io. Please like and subscribe to our podcast to be the first to hear from our amazing speakers changing the world through blockchain and crypto. If you're interested in partnering with the TF Blockchain Podcast, please email us at podcast@tfblock.io. Be on the lookout for TF Blockchain chapters coming to your city, and please reach out to us if interested in becoming a chapter director. We hope to see you soon at one of our live events. Thanks for listening, and remember, stay crypto, my friends. The views and opinions expressed at TF Blockchain events and podcasts are solely those of the ones presenting, and do not necessarily reflect the position or opinion of TF Blockchain. TF Blockchain is not responsible for the opinions or content of its guests, and does not endorse any particular company or currency. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be used to make investment decisions.